Good day, my fellow Americans and good people of the world. Today I'd like to address you in regards to a roundtable conversation that Senator Bernie Sanders shared with a few experts on Iran, and it was a very enlightening and insightful conversation, and I just had a few thoughts that I wanted to share in regards to it. I'm going to start with my conclusions in terms of what I learned about America's foreign policy orientation. I do believe that given the circumstances of, the complexity and perplexity of the international stage, that it is in America's best interest to reorient itself with the respecting of international law, to reinforce and strengthen and adhere to, in a most conscious way, the international law and the institutions that help to reinforce international law, because it does do the one thing that America can't do for itself. It helps to establish constraints and protections, because it constrains rivals from working out their differences in the form of violence, and giving them rather a vital reinforced opportunity to settle differences through in a civilized way. Violence is not civility, and it's dialogue and diplomacy that is civility, and the international law and the institutions that reinforce that and enforce international law is a way for various bodies of individuals in their own self-determined self-sovereignty to come together at a table of sisterhood and brotherhood to work out our differences in a way that is conducive to the well-being of all people, works out solutions that are in the best interest of all parties involved, respects and honors everybody's individuality and sovereignty and dominion, and also establishes a basis of truth and detects, deters, and calls out falsehoods and misleading comments. It's a way to really establish a common ground basis by which we can all come to terms most reasonably, because in that position, it is a non-hierarchical position. Nobody holds more power or authority than anyone. It's established even playing field for everyone. And this is important because from that position, America can establish its defense relationship with other nations, and other nations can establish its defense relationship in such a way that is not about offending or attacking or violating, but rather taking a stance, forming boundaries, negotiating terms and conditions of relationships, creating separations that are needed, and then making sure that there is some sort of moderating influence of trust between opposing parties, rivaling parties that can intervene on their behalf or intercede on their behalf to prevent things from being, direct violence towards one another. It's a way for us to establish, a coherence, an island of coherence by which we can all come together, and from that position, control and command our capacities in a way that is self-control and commanding our presence on the international stage, to say, like, we do what we do for a reason, and what we do is justified, and our reasoning is in the best interest of all parties involved, and then to explain ourselves and not explain it away with falsehoods or false narratives or justifications, or, we do this because we can, but legitimately, make our case, state our claims and make our case, and do so in such a way where we can find a path through, compromising some of our, desires and wants and needs of now, to take, the position of building towards a consensus that is going to give us the stability that we are requiring over time and in the long term. So international institutions help us to sort that out, where it's not an uneven playing field, where you have, like the United States coming in saying, we're a superpower and we have all this military might, and so therefore bend to our will. I'm not okay with that type of relationship for America to have with our foreign interests. That should not be our policy, to try to become the disciplinarian of the world. It is the best way for us to negotiate our domestic order in America, because it gives also a legitimate stance by which Americans can negotiate with their government how to govern on their behalf and their collective best interests. It gives a platform by which, a legitimacy by which Americans can dissent and protest against, what the American government is doing in the name of America and Americans, or on behalf of the American, as a nation and then as a people. And if that doesn't align with what the Americans believe is in their collective best interests, there is a stance by which the American people can say, international law says that you can't even do these things, and our national law, our constitutional law says you can't do these things. And so you bear no point of legitimacy by which you can justify what you're doing. And then it gives the American people a leverage point that is externalized from the domestic order, because they may not have, as of right now, the most direct capacity to influence outcomes in America to, get the government to do right by the people. But an international court could be a way for the American people to go and appeal to an outside legitimate force to ask for redress for their own nation. And it would be a compelling comparison to be able to say, the American government is saying that this is justified and this is what the American people need and what we need as a nation. But the American people themselves are giving a, alternative version to that. And it gives a way for the American people to help hold the American government in, contrast on the global public stage by appealing to international courts to say, please help rein in our government that is not, doing right by the American people and is, doing something on the international stage that is not conducive to America's, continuation of our domestic order. Because when you look at right now what's happening with the Iran war, it's definitely compromising the domestic order in America. It's burdening the American people with longstanding debt. It's costing American lives. It's inflating the cost of living for everybody. and that's an impact that's felt immediately, and it's going to have cascading long-term effects where the cost of everything is going to be inflated over time because of pricing being restructured around the fact that we don't have consistent flow of energy in order to keep society functioning and operable. So the other thing about adhering to international law, reinforcing these structures and institutions that reinforce international law, such as the United Nations and such as NATO, it helps America to adhere to the things which we claim are important to us, which is to fight for and protect human rights and human life, and to lead the world to establish democracy and reinforce and strengthen democracy so that we can build our domestic structures of democracy to help to build international structures of democracy, which helps to lessen our conflicting interests, with other nations around the world. It gives us a similar type of structural integrity that is, legally legitimized, that helps us to negotiate on terms that are even across the board, which is much harder to do when you have a political ideology based off of theocracy or based off of autocracy or dictatorship. How those people come to conclusions on behalf of that nation is not aligned with a democratic form, and so our values are very difficult to reconcile with one another. And so the chance for peaceful accord across, the international, world stage is much harder to do, because it's hard to reconcile such, stark variations that have very few things in common. So establishing common ground and continuity and consistency that could create formalized agreements that everybody can not only agree to, but uphold and adhere to. And for that to happen consistently over time, it's much harder to do when you have these starkly different interests. So international law is a way for us to come at each other in a form of democratic way where everybody has a seat at the table, everybody has stake in the game, everybody has capacity to, raise concern and state their grievances and seek redress and to formalize a complaint and to ask for, there to be some sort of corrective mechanism to step in, whether that's sanctioning or, whether it's creating more strength intensity in terms of deterrence for, people to not go in and invade somebody else's space because, one country seems to be incapable of refraining and self-constraining from, going in and forcing itself upon, another nation or whatever, that nation maybe doesn't think that that's conducive to their well-being. So it gives international law and institutions in international courts give us a way to settle our differences that isn't so straight up in your face. It gives the moderating influence that we really need. So that's how I concluded, what I heard Bernie talking about in this conversation and what I consider to be, important based off of, what they were saying, what the challenge is and why we have such a hard time. And really why and how this conflict even came about was because, failures in systems, lack of systems, no agreements on systems, and no, law-abiding terms and conditions, and no paths of redress that, are peaceful and are civilized and are based off of, finding our way into a mutual interested resolution to things. So conflict is more likely when you have, nothing else by which you can achieve the ends that you are seeking for. Now to get into some of the, actual substance of the conversation, just a few points that I wanted to touch on. One of the speakers was talking about the situation in terms of what the people in Iran are experiencing. They're hard fought for and won liberties, as limited as they were in this, fairly controlled system. They worked hard to get a little bit of freedoms and liberties back from, being essentially undercut and undermined by past and prior actions of individuals that sought to take away the self-determination of Iran as a nation, and then you put them in a precarious position by which they could be exploited by external forces. And, they spoke of the 1953, point where, America and Britain basically took away the choice of Iran to self-determine and weakened the nation, and then caused them to, go into this troubling situation for, 25 years before they ended up having, this revolution of sorts that only led to them being in this more precarious position where they are under this control that has become extreme in many ways and repressive to the people, because it's hard to control so many people and so much. With its instabilities, there's no strengths of integrities that just keep people naturally operating in domestic order. So to keep that many people in such an unstable state, they have to use repressive government controls of the people. And as things start to stabilize in some ways, the people are able to grab a hold of, build up, and reinforce more liberties and freedoms for themselves, and they build upon those into movements based off of a bunch of people that are trying to dissent from the power structures that are repressing them. And they've built that up over time for themselves. And, while they weren't completely free people, they were doing the good, hard, and necessary work to establish their freedom and take it for themselves, But now with war beset upon them, people are put in a more deep and desperate situation. The economic vitality that was starting to spring up in the aftermath of Obama signing this, Iranian nuclear deal that allowed for some of the sanctions to be dropped, allowed for prosperity to start to regenerate and recover and revive the economy there. And so a middle class grew, and then that was all taken away when Trump, pulled out of that deal in his first term in 2016. And so the middle class has fallen into poverty. And then that position, as it was stated by one of the people in the conversation, that the bottom dropped out in them, and they were forced into a precarious position, not of strength, of, building up its self-determination on its own terms, in its own way, in its own time. Now that it has this little bit of liberation that it has, garnered for itself through this, mutual agreement with, the foe that had the power to prevent them from, advancing, coming into agreement, we'll reduce our nuclear arms so that we have, our capacity for establishing nuclear arms, so that we have the capacity to help build our economics, which gives us the kind of strength that is, more invaluable and priceless than, the capacity of having the nuclear capabilities to fight back if somebody comes after us. It's a different kind of deterrence once a nation can get to a certain part of self-reliance and self-determination, because they become a valid, active participant and contributor to the global economy, and then they can have something to offer the rest of the world, that they don't have to constantly outsource violence and terror and, threat of harm if you come after us, because they're not in that precarious, desperate, cornered situation. They're in a position of strength and integrity and, respects, and people start looking to them not as, something to victimize, attack, exploit, and render, invalid or incapable of self-determination, but rather somebody that, dominates the global stage in their own way, in a form of respects of, they would not want to compromise all of the integrity that they've built up in their own nation in terms of their powerhouse capacity to offer something into the global stage of economy. They wouldn't compromise that if they had skin in the game, stake in the game, and a seat at the table, in terms of we're taking you seriously in terms of you really have something to offer the world that's good, and give them a chance to reinforce that and build upon that. It would liberate the people more, because, the nation would realize we need people to be able to, take hold of their own liberty, so that they give us more capacity to generate more economic opportunities, so that we become more viable on the world stage. And eventually over time, I foresee that could have been and still is very much a possibility. I mean, not in the immediate, but, it can be worked out, I do believe, in the best interest of all parties involved, where we can create a stabilizing situation that everybody can thrive on. But, the Iranian people have now been put in this precarious position because the U.S. has, come in and done them dirty and done them wrong. And, the other thing that was really brought hard home, and, we all can agree on that this entire exercise of the use of force and the violence done in Iran, I can't speak to Israel in this regard, but I will speak on behalf of America in this regard, and I very much agree with what one of the speakers said. This is a self-defeating strategic fiasco for the United States of America. And that, I really do believe, as they had mentioned, this was likely a reactive decision on the part of President Trump to somebody got in his ear and told him this is the biggest thing you can do internationally. And so he was convinced that, this is something that he can do and bypass Congress, and he can use it in a unitary, power fashion, and be able to assert his dominance and stake a claim on some sort of global victory of finally being able to take down Iran, this great threat, that exists or whatever. And he thought he would be capable of doing that if he asserted the dominance and used the full force measure of, U.S. military's might to just go after them and just obliterate and bombard them, But obviously he's not taking a conscious consideration of the aftermath, consequences that are going to come with this. You're taking already a hostile force that, really is intent on, retaliation and retribution. I mean, it's built into their entire theocracy, ideologies. So you go and you mess with them, and you're really only setting up a stage for a continuum of continued spectacle, negative outcome consequences. You're making this person into an enemy, not a friend. There's no way to set this right if you're going to continuously use force and violence. But somebody got in Trump's ear and was like, oh, this could be your, grand thing. And, you don't really need a strategy, which he doesn't have. But, as one of the speakers said, in lieu of, having a strategy, because he doesn't have one, he's just using, distraction by more bombs and more noise and more, propaganda and suggesting, oh, we're winning, and he's so desperate to win that he won't even make a claim as to what victory even looks like, so that he can just find his way into, this is what we're going to settle on. And I really do believe that, America has abdicated its, own self-determination and self-sovereignty by allowing Netanyahu and Israel to, determine outcomes on the global stage befit its own interests, self-centered interests. One of the speakers was, really defining this in terms of the long-standing history that Netanyahu has had in terms of his stance that the only way that Israel can survive, thrive, is through forced domination over everyone else, the undercutting and the undermining and the destabilization of everybody else, and then its empowerment, its enrichment, its strengthening, and its adhering to, alliance with the U.S. government that it can use as its, its own, military force or whatever, like a military for hire sort of thing, to go in and do the dirty work for them that they can't do alone. Netanyahu has been biting at the, bit to try to find a president that would be able to be convinced to go and do his dirty work for him. And now here we are with Trump having, personal familial ties with deep relationships with Netanyahu, him having a longstanding friendship, him having many people in his administration and high-end donors that, are very much pro-Israel aligned, and even to the point where they are willing for America to be the sacrifice in order to advance the Israel agenda of, domination of that entire area, and and then you have their whole religious aspect of it, where people are trying to turn this into some sort of holy war or whatever, where people are thinking that Israel is trying to, take over the land and like this whole entire area that somehow biblically was, promised to them or something like that. And it's like, that goes back to, what I was saying before, the requirements of an international, law is to say that while you may be operating off of the belief that this is, your birthright blessing, or that, your, form of faith and belief tells you you're justified and you deserve this, that doesn't take away the fact that, there are living people in these areas that deserve life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. They deserve to live free of violence and terror and threats of harm, and they deserve to be self-determined, and your beliefs are not conducive to our sensibilities of what we need in order for us to be a stable nation, to provide for our people a way of life that is, peaceful and robust and orderly and, capable of thriving. So like, you may think that you need to deny us life, liberty, and happiness, and self-determination, and personal dominion, and self-sovereignty, and these sorts of things in order for you to get what, you think you deserve. But international law, making the common denominator, even playing field, says, we are establishing, human rights and, sovereignty and rules of engagement in war and these sorts of things, that says that you don't really have that claim in the general sense of we are a global, order based off of many different, governing structures, but ultimately we have to at least adhere to, not being the cause for human suffering, and, we need to respect and value all human lives, and we need to not, destroy people's way of life and, destroy civilian structures and terrorize people generationally and, traumatize them generationally. We need to not do those sorts of things, because it destabilizes the whole order for everyone. And you're just creating a perpetual cycle of conflict that will never be transcended or ascended out of. In order for you to claim that you have some sort of right or authority to do this, it's like, no, you don't have that right. And so the other things is one of the speakers talking about, that Israel doesn't have consequences for its actions, and it's putting everybody else in the position of blame. So the consequences, will be placed upon America in this instance. And people are just looking to Israel as like, this is just the way they are. These people who are doing violence against other people because that's how they need to, as one of the speakers said, assert their own, defense. It's a position of weakness, using violence as weakness. It's, not strength. And, it destabilizes the whole nation. And, another comment that they made me think about how, Trump's first term, again, left the Iranian deal, and Trump is trying to change the narrative to make it seem like he's erasing Obama's legacy in order to supplant it with his own sense of like, look what I accomplished. Nobody else could do what I've done. I've done such great things. And Trump is erasing history. He's rewriting history. He's rebranding, America's identity that casts him as some sort of like supreme leader who's, leading America into greatness. And, his ideal of greatness is the sense of we can go and fuck with anybody, excuse my language, do anything we want to anybody, and there are no consequences to it. And, it's ruining our reputation for being a peaceable nation, a leader of the free world. We can no longer legitimately say we're that, because under the leadership of Trump, we have been led to be, the disciplinarian, the for hire military force, and the bully. And, just because we have the capacity to use might, we are, using it as if it's right, no matter what, and we can do no harm sort of thing, and we can do no wrong. that everything's justified. That's the way Trump is trying to cast this, and that's why he's fishing for victory instead of seeking it, because he's determined and he knows what that means and represents. He doesn't understand that. He doesn't have any sort of policy. He's allowing America's policy to be dictated by Israel, which was another speaking point that one of the speakers was talking about. And, going through the history lesson that, they shared in this conversation, helped me to get a better grasp of why we are where we are now. Talking about the, in 1953 that, Iran was a fledgling democracy, and, America and the British decided that they were going to cut off the growing structures of self-determination that Iran was trying to possess for itself. And, it created a bitterness because, they were being exploited and undermined, and they were trying to self-determine and claim that, personal dominion, and instead they were undercut by the people who had the power to suppress them. And so an anti-American sentiment grew from that. Obviously, there's bitterness to that. How could you be okay with somebody that came in and did you dirty and did you wrong? It goes back to what I was saying before about Iran having the potential to become, self-determined in such a way that could help them to become real players in the economic stage. And yeah, they could become a powerhouse because of that, but it could be done in such a way where it's, liberating for the people to the point where, they would seek to continue to establish, justice and balance and, a democratic way to interrelate with other nations of the world, because it would be in their collective best interest to be in a mutual accord with everyone, in a mutual peaceful accord, because that helps them to continuously, perpetuate their prosperity into posterity, and that seems like the reasonable thing that any, nation that cared about their people and their children would want to do. And, that's very much what America tried doing in its evolution, establishing itself as a leader of the free world. And Iran could have been a representation of how to become another leader of the free world, and then we can have a dynamic free world leadership from many different fronts of people, establishing it and reinforcing it and abiding by it and adhering to it. And then again, having this table of, international law and institution that we can all come to that table of negotiation to, debate and dialogue and, work out in, a diplomatic way to resolve our conflicts in such a way that is peaceful and reasonable, so we don't ever have to drag everybody into war, because war is self-defeating. It weakens everybody, destabilizes the global order. It makes everybody across the board suffer. Yes, in different ways and different dynamics and different intensities, but everybody suffers overall. There's no good can come from going to war. And the only time you should ever go to war is if there is, a clear path to victory that will help to secure peace, to reestablish global order that brings us all back into alignment with everybody with a seat at the table back at, the institutions of international law, to say we've sorted out our differences, prevented people from, getting carried away with themselves, and doing things that are harmful to a free and fair, societies and global order and civilization development. That's why we went to war in, the First World War and the Second World War. And so, but there's no clear path to a resolution that can work out the establishment of peace and the securing of peace in this warring conflict that has been instigated by Israel, and America has been dragged into it. I don't think that America would be doing what it's doing right now in Iran if not for the fact that Netanyahu has exploited his relationship ties with the people in the Trump administration to convince them that this is the right thing to do, even though it is not in the best interest of America at all. And Trump is now in the thick of it, and he thought America Might was so great that he could just go in and, be quick and easy in and out sort of thing, But now he's realizing how messy war truly is, and that he's not going to be able to have an easy out in any of this because he did the wrong thing. And now he needs to reconcile that, and he needs to establish a coherent path towards peace, and restore integrities and to restore ties and to do right by, all people of the world who he has just put in this precarious situation, including everybody in the region and neighboring areas, that have been brought into, more instability. And, listening to the fact that all the people in Lebanon that have been displaced, I think Bernie said something like 700,000 people have been displaced from their homes. And, I think I read something earlier this morning about there being an attack by Israel on those places where people have been, moved to for safety, and there was like 8 people killed or something like that. So, there's nowhere safe for people to go is another thing that one of the speakers spoke about, is like, the people in Iran are like in a precarious situation. Like, there's no air defenses, so there's nothing stopping, any of these bombs from coming in. There's no air raid sirens, there's no alert system, and so people don't know that a bomb is coming until they hear the jets and they hear the explosions. And people are having to adjust the way that they live because they're trying to find the safest position they can be in when there really is nowhere safe to go. Adjusting how they sleep and orient in their houses to stay away from, outer walls and windows and stuff. For people to be living in a precarious state, people having to flee their own homes, to go to different parts of Iran for safety, or even fleeing the country altogether. And it's like, there's so many good people in Iran that did not want for this at all, and now so many people are going to be suffering the outcome consequences of this like perpetual instability. And, nobody wanted for this. Nobody in their right mind who cared about human life would want for this for anyone. And my heart just goes out to, the people of Iran who are now in this more precarious situation. And another thing that they touched on, one of the speakers was saying, like, this is probably going to more deeply entrench and strengthen the resolve of and reinforce the anti-American sentiment in the governing bodies of Iran. And the fact that, there is no like pinnacled head, of power there. It is dispersed. And these like power cells that are able to, be autonomous in their operation makes it really difficult to really bring down the whole system because, it's so reinforced in all these different areas. And so, to bring it down, like as if this is going to be able to be some sort of regime change, was just never possible. But now their resolve is strengthened, especially in the anti-American sentiment. And then the newly appointed supreme leader or whatever, which, his father, his mother, and his wife all perished, and apparently he was injured as well in this, bombardment. It has a personal tie of, anger, that he does not seem like the type of person that's going to resolve that in, a healing, helpful capacity, but more like hurtful, revengeful kind of reactionary response in like kind. And, him having a letter that was sent out today, even acknowledging like, you killed our children. Don't think that we're not going to do something about that, and in the like stepping away from the I don't want anybody to fight or conflict, I can understand where he's coming from with that. I'm not giving a sentiment to say it's justified or it's the right thing to do, but, you can't go and fuck with people's, lives and their domestic order, as disorderly as it was from our view and outside perspective, and for the people that lived in there and were being oppressed and harmed and things like, I can totally respect all of those things, but you can't expect that, we go and we cause this damage and for them to just not do anything about it. They're going to entrench in this sensibility that they need to, heighten their capacity for violence because violence has been used against them. Two wrongs don't make a right. Never can. And might does not make right unless that might is the might of great care. If we wanted to do right by the Iranian people, if we want to do right by, the neighboring countries, if we wanted to do right, by Israel, would be to not help them in their, senseless, mindless ambitions to dominate everybody, but put a check and balance on them. If they would have called us and said, hey, we're planning on doing this thing and it's going to put you guys in harm's way, giving the United States a heads up, the United States had an opportunity with all of its leverage that it has over, Israel to say, no, you are not. Because you're going to be putting us in harm's way. We're not assuming your risk because you're making a very short-sighted, expedient, reactionary sort of thing just because you think you can, because I'm going to tell you right now you can't. And if you do, you're putting us in harm's way and there will be consequences for that, which means it's going to jeopardize our relationship. And remember that you very much depend on us. We have had the leverage point to be able to say no and to reaffirm that and mean it enthusiastically. And instead, Trump does not care and has no strategic thinking and probably had no advisors coming to him saying, don't do this. And he probably just said, just go along with this plan or whatever. And, we're going to do what we did in Venezuela, man. That was an in and out and done and over with. And look at what we've accomplished. We control that whole nation now, as an auxiliary force or whatever. He didn't understand the complexity that not every nation is the same. Not every dynamic variable is the same. And he disregarded that. And he didn't measure the capacities, the capabilities, of the power structures in Iran at all. He was misled and misguided by, Netanyahu in Israel that, has always been very intent on dragging America in to fight its wars on its behalf. And here we are. I very much believe that I have not listened to the statement put out by the new leader in Iran in its totality. I have only heard dog roll sum-ups of the statements. From what I've heard, the intent remains clear that, this will not go unanswered, that Iran asserts its self-determination. It has been put in the position where that determination now also has to be responsive to, in like kind for the, harm that was done to them. And, a pre-warning of the fact that you brought this upon yourself, but we're not going to allow ourselves to be, made into fools, or to try to diminish, to make it seem like, we aren't as capable as we are. I mean, that's what I heard out of the statements. And, and then responding to, again, with the school, it's like, that was wrong. And I think that could have been resolved for the fact that if Trump would have came out and said it was a misunderstanding, it was a miscalculation, it was an error on our part, we did not intend for that to happen, and we're sorry, And in the letter response, something of the effect of, the conditions for the ceasing of their, position from which they feel that they have to respond, and the way in which they're going to choose to respond, and the way that they are, asserting control to keep the Strait of Hormuz shut down. These conditions will continue to make the situation difficult in the world, but we're not going to relent on that because we realize that's our only leverage. But we do have conditions by which we can, cease this conflict, and they've put out terms and conditions for, not as Trump wants, absolute unconditional surrender. That's never going to happen. But to say, like, here are the terms and conditions by which we're willing to, agree to cease this, warring and conflict and need for, retaliation and retribution. But you have to meet it on the terms and conditions of which we feel is going to be most conducive to our, sensibilities, that we don't have to worry about you coming after us again. I mean, you have to think that that's a reasonable position to come into, how they may respond is likely to be unreasonable, and it's going to be harsh and violent because, that is how they respond, being, a nation that does do terror. And then it's being supported by Russia. It is in Russia's collective best interest to support Iran because of how Iran supports, Russia. Russia's taking advantage of this opportunity, to refill its, financial coffers of, being one of the only few, oil reserves that's available. And I'm sure Russia, helped convince them, Iran, take the stance, you're keeping the strait closed, and then we can just draw this out, for a very long time. And Russia will be able to refill its coffers, and then it will be able to not only complete its, campaign to take over Ukraine, but then continue on in advancing in the other sistering, neighboring nations there. And there's nothing stopping them because, there was literally nothing stopping, the US and Israel from, deciding to join forces and, invade Iran. So, that was one of the things that Bernie really mentioned, was the fact that this sets a precedence to justify it. What's stopping China from going after Taiwan? What's stopping North Korea from, pointing its forces towards South Korea? It's created this whole complex dynamic situation of instabilities. And really the only way that's going to solve for this is if America reconfirms, reinforces, and reestablishes the integrities and the legitimacies and the power capacities of the international order of international law in the institutions that help create that dynamic of an even playing field and a negotiating table everybody can come to erase their, concerns and, establish terms and conditions for peaceful resolutions. And that would take America, reconfirming its alliance and alignment with the UN, and to reestablish and reaffirm its, commitments to NATO, and to reaffirm its position on the global stage as a leader of the free world, and to invite others to come into mutual relationship as being also leaders of the free world. And a free world is one in which conflict is not the answer, violence is not the answer, but love, respect, is. And the institutionalization of law and order, and the adherence to that, and the agreement that we settle our differences through words. The power of words and dialogue and diplomacy and conversation, communication evolves us. Violence devolves us. And it destroys everything that we've grown and built up over time. One of the other things that I heard was made in the statement by the Iranian leader, the new Iranian leader, was that, they wanted some sort of restitution or something for the damage that was done. And, I understand. I understand, especially with everything that's being set back. It was one of the things that one of the speakers said is this is civilian infrastructures. These are neighborhoods. These are roads. These are desalination places. These are mosques and buildings that have been there, historical buildings and, homes and residencies and banks that, are in communities. And, these are not, military targets that pose a direct threat to, the international stability in order to keep everybody safe and sound from a larger conflict arising. This is, harming people and preventing them from living their lives and, creating chaos and disorder and forcing the government there to be more controlling and oppressive to the people. And it's taking away life and liberty and, sensibilities and sanity of the people there. It's traumatizing them. And, I want for this to be able to have a peaceful resolution. I don't think it's going to be possible as long as we have a president in the form of, President Pandemonium. President Trump is doing the wrong thing right now. He's not doing right by Americans or right by the world. And he's unreasonable, so he can't be negotiated with. And he needs a win. He needs a victory. And he's, used this bullying capacity to bully everybody to fall in line with him economically with his tariffs, going in and, trying to play peacemaker by saying, like, you better fall in line and do the right thing or America, will come after you, sort of thing. So it's set things up in a precarious position for everyone. And so he's not going to be reasonable and come to the table and say, okay, maybe we need to not do this anymore. Let's work this out to, some ends that everybody can at least agree on for now. This is a way to stay the fighting, stop it here. And then we can work towards our, collective mutual objectives of sorting out our differences and finding a way to not have to be in this contentious relationship with each other anymore. Like, how can we solve for our greatest concerns while, your greatest concerns being assuaged in terms of, like, we know that you don't want us to come back every 6 months and mow you down again, which we were just there in June and caused havoc, and now we're back again, doing worse, doing more. Like, I don't think that Trump is a reasonable man, so for him he doesn't have a capacity to negotiate on terms and conditions of respect or mutual interest. And so, he's going to continue to use power, might, force, violence to try to make everybody dominate everybody, force everybody into compliance and conformity with what his ideal version of what other people must become. This is the same similar tactic. This is how he treats the American people. This is how he treats any opposing forces, any dissent, in any of his, political rivals. This is how he treats other nations. Anybody that he has leverage or power over, he will, force dominate over them to try to force them to do what he wants, bend to his will. This is predatory behavior. It's exactly what it is, and he's already proven himself as being a predator. He's found liable for sexual assault. He's all over the Epstein files, and his relationship with the people in other nations has always been about, dominating them, using tariffs against them. You did something I don't like, so I'm going to increase your tariffs, these sorts of things. It's all about, preying on other people's, weaknesses and vulnerabilities and exploiting them for his personal gains and advantages, which always align to his need to feed his ego, the sense that, he's so capable and he's so great and he's done all these things, Never mind, he doesn't care if those outcomes have been violence or other people have had to suffer harm because of it, Predators don't care when they they don't care about harming their prey, and he looks at everybody as prey. I mean, even people in his orbit that are supposed to be like his friends or whatever, he looks at them in terms of what can I get out of you and how can I get it? And I'm willing to use my power in order to get that, even if it's just in the suggestive way of like, don't step out of line, because I will turn on you in a dime, because I'm all about making sure I get what I want, even if it means that it's, you are going to be, harmed or put at a disadvantage. He's always angling for that position in which he can dominate. And, it's who he is as a person. It's his character. So it's reasonable to expect that that's how he's going to form all relationships of power dynamics. And so when you give a person like that more power and control, they become more aggressive and more violent. And their natural tendency is to very easily be moved in the direction of, even with false assertions, that it's in your best interest to use your power and capacity to do violence against other people and attack their weaknesses, because the end result will be that you will be able to elevate your sense of majesty and greatness and, capacity to do these things. And, then you can go and seek out the, your deeply embedded sycophants to pour upon you praise of how great you are. We're so glad that you strategically, help us to achieve this thing that we didn't really think that we needed, but, you've convinced us now that, it was the right thing to do. And so, thank you for doing it, despite the fact when you look at things objectively, it's like, wow, you really screwed things up for everybody, didn't you? There's nothing to be thankful or grateful about. Trump has really messed things up for everybody, and he'll never set things right because he will never take extreme ownership. He will never assume responsibility. He will never, do right by people. He's going to find a way to pin this on somebody else and to claim victory in some form or fashion, even if it doesn't really equate to anything that we can say within tangibilities or reasonabilities, that it was right for everybody, that this was the right thing to do, because it was wrong. It was absolutely wrong on every front. And his only option right now that is in the best interest of everybody for him to step out and say, this was the wrong thing to do. We made a mistake. We are sorry for it. We're willing to assume responsibility for that. Here's what we offer in an olive branch peace offering to set things right. That's what he needs to do. It is the only option that he has that is the right thing to do. I challenge him to take that on with a sense of, urgency for the matter of like, things are going to get worse if you do not do this now. So, and that was made very clear in this conversation that Bernie Sanders had with these communicators in this roundtable session. They just kind of like gave insights of the situation, like where we're coming from, how we got into this, where we're at, and where things are likely to go if we do not, shift things into a corrective mechanism. To me, like, what is most important is to find a way to stabilize the situation, preserve life, preserve infrastructures, and find a way to, turn this into a silver lining of saying, like, maybe this wasn't the right thing to do, but maybe it was necessary in a sense of, like, now we are wide-eyed, and very conscious of, the precarity of our relationship with Iran, our precarity of our relationship with Israel. And now we have an opportunity from this position to reassess those relationships and approach them in a different way that is more conducive to creating the stable domestic and international order that America needs in order for it to thrive and to continue on without becoming, this target for retaliation and retribution and these sorts of things. Like, we want to create lasting friendships and promote goodwill and to be respectful to all people's sovereignty and to reinforce, a sensibility of, we want to operate in a place of, truth and honesty with ourselves and with each other to, make sure that outcomes are serving the best interest of all people involved. That is how you become a leader of the free world. And that's the position that America needs to take. And Trump needs to wake up to the reality that is really his only option moving forward, if his concern and his care really is about, making America great. So with that, I want to thank all of the speakers in this conversation, and I want to thank Bernie Sanders for bringing this very important conversation to the table so it can be discussed. And thank you for your valuable time and attention to consider all the things that I've had in terms of insights. I'm grateful to be able to have a better understanding of my considerations as I perspective events as they continue to unfold, and determine like how I would approach a resolution, to be able to untangle this messiness and resolve in a peaceful resolution for everybody. Seeing myself in a position of being able to be a decision maker, I understand what I would do differently, and I think it's important to let the American people know how I see things are going in the wrong direction and how I see they can be diverged into a new direction that's corrective. I mentioned it before, that I think that it would be in the best interest of America to find a way to come into accord with Iran. As difficult and challenging as that was, it's not impossible. Obama was able to create this, agreement that Trump abandoned, that was getting us somewhere, and it was a foothold by which we could have taken greater strides towards helping to, build, a relationship of mutual respects that could have eventually led us to being, lessen the hostilities and to assuage the anti-American sentiment in that nation, and made, Iran embrace their best tendencies instead of defaulting to their worst ones. We would have given them an opportunity to, overcome, their past histories and to embrace a future full of potential of, all that they can be if they are in a mutual alignment with us working together in collective best interests. That's where peaceful resolve would come to. And then again, realizing the, precarity of the situation, and we can't just let everybody who has power to do bad things to get away with it. We need international law. We need to reinforce international institutions that can enforce international law, and there needs to be, courts that hold people accountable for human rights violations and, doing war crimes and these sorts of things, and it needs to be responsive immediately, and it needs to not be stopped, by, some superpower interest saying like, no, I'm going to stand in the way for you to not be able to approach, a corrective mechanism. There needs to be an even playing field where any person that seeks resolution and corrective mechanism should be able to initiate that, and then all parties involved should engage in dialogue and, debate about it, and find, the best practices by which we can achieve the resolution where, people are appropriately held accountable and made responsible for, and face like consequences, legitimate consequences for those actions, because it's the best way to create deterrence. Something that one of the people said in the conversation is that, Iran is taking these hardline stances because it's their only way to defend themselves. They've been pressed into this position of desperation in which they have to retaliate in order to defend that which they still have, left in terms of integrity of their nation. And not integrity like it's doing the right thing, but integrity like its capacity to hold itself as a sovereign. And then, Israel's doing the forced domination of everybody, weakening, suppressing, oppressing, attacking all of its neighbors in order to preserve its form of protection. We should create an international, institution of international order that says, you're allowed to, be independent and self-sovereign, but not if it's at the cost of oppressing other people. And for there to be corrective mechanisms to prevent people from taking those hardline stances that are not in the collective best interest of everybody, and that's only going to happen when we have something at the table that says, nobody should be helping Israel to get away with, being this oppressive and domineering. The same thing goes for Russia, which is actually appalling that right before all of this, America lifted the sanctions on Russian oil, and now all of a sudden Russian oil is, hot commodity in demand, and they're able to refill their coffers. I don't think this was by accident. I don't think this was just some random coincidence. I think this was a human-made, by design, ordered up and served opportunity to create this shift in the global order that allows people to be in a dog-eat-dog, mighty crush the weak, free-for-all hellscape. And it's sad and it's unfortunate, especially because America's, government under the leadership of Donald Trump is essentially saying Trump is putting America's, wealth and, global standing and our reputation and the lives of American citizens and soldiers at risk, put it all on the line, betting it, going all in, that our powerful army is so powerful that we can go in and we can just do whatever we want. And there's, the consequences are just going to be, minor casualties of war that, it's going to happen. As he says, he just passes off nonchalant. Yeah, it happens. People died. Yeah, it happens. That's war. Americans might be in threat of some sort of invading force to come into America and do some sort of violence here and maybe cause harm to people. Trump says, yeah, it's going to happen. Yeah, it happens. Instead of being like, no, we're not trying to create this situation where we have to be worried about that kind of stuff. Especially in a world where many people are radicalized because we're pushed into this extremism, far right extremism that is all about isolationism and superiorities and hierarchies and power plays and superior races and economic power structures and enforcing those and reinforcing those and bolstering those and legitimizing those, because it puts everybody else in a desperate state, a precarious state, a vulnerable state, so they're easily exploited. It's suppressing those people so that they can be dominated. And it's happening all across the board. And what we're seeing in terms of the Iran, war is, a manifestation of that. Just another form of the same thing, which is, these oppressive power structures are really coming after us all and trying to, especially in America. Donald Trump has set everybody up for failure. He has eradicated the middle class. He has destabilized, any of the structures that were holding people up, in a sensibility of, being able to at least survive in struggle, made it impossible for people to be supported, breaking down all of these systems of, social supports and things like that. He has now disempowered people from being able to rise up and dissent against him, doing things that are not in our collective best interests. And he's been concentrating power and money and influence into these power structures that are his people, his insulated pockets of thriving he is reinforcing, creating this, autocracy, oligarchy, authoritarian dictatorship, positively reinforcing all of that in this tyrannical fashion, disempowering the American people so they can't rise up against him, to the point where that that's what he's doing, because he doesn't even care about how he's harming his MAGA base. And they're, many of them are moving away from saying man, I can't be for what you're doing because you're ruining my life. You're taking away my livelihood, You're making my cost of living so much that I can't even afford to live. I can't even afford to think of how I would, get out of this mess, because you made it so uncertainties, so many uncertainties and so many fears and so many doubts. I can't, try to better my life because you're just going to pull that rug out from underneath me. And he constantly does that. He's doing it to farmers. He's doing it to manufacturing, he's doing it to small businesses, while he's concentrating power in devoting the American, taxpayers' money to feeding into corporate welfares to help to bolster, AI. And to bolster cryptocurrency and to, bolster the military and, to bolster, protections of foreign interests where he happens to have, his branding properties at, and so that they become, a more welcoming situation for them to negotiate good terms for him to start a business there, to make profits, for self-profiteering. In the meantime, he's not doing anything to establish, laws or legislation or situations that improve the American situation. But what he's hard pressed on right now, what he says is most important, and he refuses to do anything else until the SAVE Act is created, which prevents people from being able to have the capacity to vote him out. So he's disempowering, he's delegitimizing, he's disenfranchising, and he is creating destitution for more and more people. A desperate situation that makes it hard for people to rise up against him. That's what he's doing. That's his game plan. He's a predator who is preying on the American people right now. And, something that one of the speakers said in this conversation with Senator Sanders was that, the people in Iran were starting to rise up to, create these democratic capacities, but they were in a precarious situation, so they didn't have the capacity to rise up and overcome. And that's what's happening in America right now too. And the war just, complicates things for Americans, but it makes it easier for Trump to get away with his oppression, because he's doing it under the guise of, it's the war that's, happening. But we got to do the war because, whatever justification he gives in this, minute from whim to whim, none of it's right, none of it's justified, none of it's reasonable, none of it's fair. And the American people will need to do more than just wait until the next election to be able to do something to change this. I really believe there's a way for us to help to reinforce our own institutional and economic stabilities without worrying about the government coming in to, do right by us finally. The American people themselves can start working together, in, solidarity with one another. And take direct action and come to each other's mutual aid in a sense of, we are, individual sovereign, but collectively sovereign, and we have to be there for each other, because right now our government is becoming violent against us economically, politically, even through the use of force. We have policing and, the use of military forces on our streets. Like, this isn't an invasion by, a domestic invader. And it's in the form of our federal government. So we, the people, need to stand up and reinforce our self-determination and to take that power back before the government gets too out of hand and it prevents us from being able to unite and to stand up against this. So with that, I'm grateful for your valuable time, attention, and consideration. And again, thank you very much for the speakers in this conversation. And thank you again, Senator Sanders, for bringing up this very important issue for consideration. Until next time, be well.